welcome everybody. For those of you who've stayed on after our last session, thank you for staying, and for new people, welcome. My name is Becky, I'm Head of Immersive at StoryFutures Academy, and I'm really delighted today to just be introducing Mohen Leo, who will be running our Masterclass this evening. Mohen, like most people in XR, has about 7 different job titles. I'm not going to run through them all, I'll let him explain what he does in a minute, but he does have an impressive set of credentials to his name. So initially a digital artist and VFX supervisor working on an impressive array of films, including 2012 and The Martian and Rogue One, for which he was Academy and BAFTA Award nominated. But more recently working with ILMxLAB, that's Lucasfilm's immersive entertainment studio, very notably on the Vader Immortal, very popular interactive narrative piece that was made for Oculus Quest, for which he was a narrative designer. So we're really looking forward to hearing more about that in a minute. More generally, it's been fantastic for StoryFutures Academy to be working with ILMxLAB over the last few months, starting with when we hosted executive in charge Vicky Dolls-Beck on this very stage in October, back as part of the Creative XR program. And then since then, they've been working with us on a creative mentoring program where 4 great companies from around the UK's creative clusters have had access to amazing ILMxLAB expertise and mentoring as part of our program. So it's been brilliant to have them on that. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Mohen Leo to the stage to do our Masterclass this evening. Thank you.
Oops. Hi. Man, I don't know what you were thinking, like it's a 90-minute class. So if you think it's going to be like some fantastically rehearsed, well-written 90 minutes, it's not. It's like, basically I'm going to bring up slides and I'm going to try to remember why I put them in there. And then eventually I'll run out of slides and then we'll do a Q&A. So the focus of this is going to be the narrative design and the process of our narrative design on Vader Immortal. Already said we can jump through that. I basically have worked as a visual effects supervisor for a long time on a bunch of films. And then for most of the last 3 years, I worked at ILMxLAB. And a big focus of my work was development of new projects. So through the pitch phase and then in some cases beyond that. ILMxLAB, just in case you're not aware of it, it is Lucasfilm's immersive entertainment division. It's based in San Francisco at the moment. And I don't have to explain to you what immersive is because, but there's basically, both in obviously content creation and in the audience, you have the traditional side of things where for digital media it tends to be whether it's games or film or television. You basically watch it through a screen, and then the immersive stuff is more the idea that this takes place around you. I think it's worth mentioning that immersive doesn't necessarily mean like that you put on glasses, and doesn't even mean that you hold up an iPhone. We were also involved in, for example, the Falcon ride at Galaxy's Edge, and it's really more the idea that immersive entertainment allows you to get to the other side of that screen. You're not just watching fictional content or fictional world through a screen, but you actually get to step in the other side and have that digital content be all around you and interact with you. For ILM, actually our first sort of foray into real-time rendering came certainly through virtual production. And this is kind of crazy. So this is from, must be like 99 or 2000. Someone at ILM basically jerry-rigged Unreal at the time to allow a real-time preview of, you can see right there, of what these buildings were going to look like for a director of photography on AI, so that it could line up shots on, on buildings that would be built in visual effects later. And then, obviously, through the years, these technologies became sort of more and more common, allowing filmmakers to interact with digital content the same way that they used to shooting a real set, shooting real characters. We started on Rogue One to use real-time rendered content for lighting. So here's like an LED dome that we used for the cockpit shots on Rogue One. And then you may have seen that for The Mandalorian, just the first pictures were released this week. We basically used this really elaborate LED setup with real-time rendered content that is on-the-fly perspective corrected with a tracked camera, so you can get effectively visual effects, digital set extensions shot in camera live, and you can walk away from set effectively with a final shot. Big part of this also, probably around the time of Rogue One, this is solo, but on Rogue One, we started using virtual reality to allow production designers to preview sets before they were built. And so here's James Klein sort of reviewing that train set from Solo. And Gareth Edwards, for example, on Rogue One really appreciated the opportunity to review set designs in VR as well before the sets were built. And so around that time, we started thinking, well, if we can let content creators like directors of photography use VR to step into the world of Star Wars, then why not do that with audiences as well? So for me, sort of one of the early questions then was like, well, why do you want to tell stories in VR in the first place? And there's sort of I probably started around 5 years ago in earnest, sort of playing around with VR. And initially just really enjoyed this idea of really getting to the other side of the screen, like being immersed in that world of the content and interacting with it. But for me, like one of the seminal moments really was an experience made by The Void. That's a company that we worked with later on several other projects as well, but this is something they developed before our involvement with them, a Ghostbusters experience. And if you're not familiar with The Void, it's basically location-based, 4 players at the same time, and they have a physical set that is lined up with the virtual content so that you can reach out, you can touch walls, you can interact with the content. They also add like effects like wind, heat, smells, all of those things into the experience, and it really helps sort of sell that. And I specifically remember that when I did this Ghostbusters experience, there's a moment where you stand on the outside of a balcony of like maybe the 20th floor or so of a building in New York, and you have like wind blowing in your face, and the balcony is kind of like rocking under your feet. And it's really, really visceral experience. But because we were about to work with them, they actually allowed us to then walk through that same space afterwards, which you're normally not allowed to. And you could see basically that I was just standing literally on a wooden board that was sort of a little bit rickety, and there's a fan that blows at you. And the crazy thing for me was that at that moment I realized something, because I was looking at that board, and rationally I knew that had been really standing like 10 minutes earlier. But there was a very loud part of my brain that went like, no. Like, we were standing on a balcony, I remember that, because the memory of the virtual experience was more vivid and in a weird way more convincing than the rational understanding of where it had actually been. And so I realized that VR is sort of maybe the unique medium where you can create memories. You can literally write a memory that somebody else will then have as a personal experience, not something they saw on a screen, but that they carry away as like a personal memory. And that is I think, something that other digital media can't do. So I decided to go full-time, work with ILMxLAB, because I was very excited about that. My involvement on Vader Immortal went a little bit further than on many of the other projects, because it was, I'll get into that. It was an interesting phase at the time I joined ILMxLAB, and I ended up actually being involved in something of a role of like a narrative designer throughout the project. I know that job title means a lot of things in games, or a lot of different things. In this particular case, I functioned primarily sort of as someone who would negotiate the priorities of our screenwriter David Goyer, and our game designers, and try to find sort of ways that both story and gameplay and interaction would support each other. If you haven't played Vader Immortal, I'll show you a quick trailer and then get the sense.
You've caused us considerable inconvenience. In a moment, the Lord of this monolith will give you a task, a word of advice. Do not anger Vader.
Now that Vader's found you, he's in reach of enormous power. You must escape.
Grab my hand!
I wonder what Vader is after.
It appears Vader has finally found his candidate. And our future is in your hands. Vader is here.
You are the one I've been searching for. Do as I command.
Is there any version of this plan that doesn't end up with us being dead?
So Vader Immortal is basically a episodic content. It's 3 episodes that are all out now. Each episode probably plays between like 35 and 45 minutes, and depending on how fast you play through it. And so in total, the whole thing has sort of roughly the running time of like a feature film, like maybe around 2 hours or so. So I want to give a quick disclaimer, which you're all well aware of, obviously. It's so early in VR storytelling that nobody can tell you what's the right way to tell VR stories, right? I mean, it's basically like as if somebody in the 1920s told you definitively the way to make a film. I was actually going to say 1910s, but I didn't want to put Birth of a Nation up there. So what I'm about to present is just the choices that we made, some of the logic or the thinking behind the choices that we made, and you may come to completely different conclusions. So that's sort of part of the fun right now. While we were shooting Rogue One here in London, the team in San Francisco started thinking about what would make for an interesting VR experience. And you may remember in the early days there was definitely like a lot of emphasis on presence, on place. And so the team started thinking about what would be like a really unique place that people would love to visit in VR that they haven't seen before. And they, Rogue One established Vader's castle for the first time. And so this idea came up that it would be a VR experience basically set at Vader's castle. ILM released, ILMxLAB released like a teaser trailer. And it basically just set out that, okay, it's going to be about Vader, it's going to be set on Mustafar, and it's going to be in VR. There were some other ideas from that time that actually stuck through the development of the project. And so one of them is really this idea that sort of under Vader's castle on Mustafar, there's a hidden ancient fortress. And so for me, that was so impressive because it's a scene that feels like it's out of a movie, but you're part of it, and you're actually one of the protagonists in that scene. And it's not like a cinematic in a lot of video games where suddenly the control is yanked away from you. You're participating throughout that scene, and the effect is that you feel like you've actually lived through a moment, like a high action moment in a movie, and that's exactly what we wanted. And so what we realized is that we didn't want to make a story about Darth Vader. We wanted to make a story about you meeting Darth Vader and you exploring the secrets beneath his castle. And in a much broader way, we wanted to tell a story where you are the hero of your own Star Wars adventure. And as soon as we sort of arrived at that, like a lot of decisions actually became suddenly much easier, because that's something that a lot of people like that grew up with Star Wars have always imagined doing. You know, they've always played Star Wars, and everyone had like a head full of ideas of what they wanted to do if they could be in Star Wars, you know, whether it's like jumping to hyperspace or fighting with a lightsaber or, you know, using the Force. And so all of these things suddenly flew really, really easily as like options, and informed basically what we wanted to make. I also want to mention that what's really important, I think, here as well, is that people sometimes talk about VR storytelling like a sort of inventing something new out of a vacuum. And in my opinion, that's absolutely not true. Obviously, it relies, you know, in particular in the case of a company like ours, on like cinematic storytelling and all of the, you know, standards and ideas that have evolved over 100 years there. But just as much, it relies on the rich experience of the games industry over the last 40 plus years of figuring out how to tell interactive stories. And in the last 25 years, sort of, you know, people like Hideo Kojima and Neil Druckmann and Amy Hennig, who we had the privilege to actually talk to, because at the time she was working on a Star Wars project, really developing this idea of cinematic interactive content. And so whatever little bit of innovation we may have achieved on this project is 100% on, you know, building on what people like that have done, you know, over decades. And that's sometimes a little bit difficult to get people from a film background to understand, because I think most people in the games industry naturally look up to cinema, and they, you know they're Joseph Campbell, and they appreciate sort of the rich history of cinema. But what we found is quite often you bring people from the film industry in, and the idea that maybe if they want to work on VR content like this, they should know their Uncharted 2 or their Last of Us is very strange to them, and they're actively resisting it. And so that's actually been a challenge to try and bring, in particular, some of the older generation of the film industry, get them to understand that just like you have to know your film classics, you have to know your game classics as well if you actually want to work in this field. If you're working in games, sort of the idea of pillars is obviously probably familiar to you. So it's this idea that you basically early in the project decide what are the things that are really critically important to the development of your project, so that as you go along, you can check back against that and go like, are we staying true to our ideas? And these were sort of the pillars that we came up with early on. The rich, authentic Star Wars world was really the idea that we wanted to make the depiction of Star Wars in our experience as close to the movies as possible. So characters should look exactly like they looked in the films, ships, environments, things like that. So because we have the advantage of obviously working with ILM and with Lucasfilm, you know, we were able to get access to like an actual, like, you know, Darth Vader costume from that was used in the films. We can use some of the same assets that are used for the films as well, you know, and bring them over into real-time engines. Key, basically, the participatory narrative, that you're actually taking part in the story, and I'll dive deeper into that. My Star Wars fantasy, that wish fulfillment, like really trying to deliver on the key things that as a kid, basically, you were imagining you would want to do in Star Wars. And then a big part of it also, the character-focused experience. We wanted to make sure that, or at least attempt that, the moments where you're dealing with Star Wars characters are just sort of as delightful and engaging as the ones where you're like wielding a lightsaber or, you know, fighting or doing some other action part. And so going a little bit deeper into some of these points there and decisions. The interactive narrative part, obviously, you know, if you've worked in games, you know this, like probably actually before the invention of mass media, majority of narrative was probably interactive, you know, because actually somebody face-to-face telling people a story. And then even pre-digital Dungeons and Dragons in the 70s, really sort of laid a foundation for a lot of the principles of interactive narrative. And then you got your Infocom text adventures, and then eventually, fairly cinematic-looking interactive stories as well. And if you contrast that with, I used to be someone who was actually fairly dogmatic about the VR has to be interactive. I've kind of softened on that stance. I think it's absolutely possible to make great VR that isn't interactive, and I think in particular with things like volumetric capture and stuff like that, there's going to be an opportunity to do really cool stuff. But in the context of what we wanted to do, which is deliver on that Star Wars fantasy, I don't think a non-interactive version would have worked, because you can't really be the protagonist of the story if you can't interact with the world. And so what's critical to that, is that sense of agency. And agency can sort of exist on many scales. Quite often, actually, we opt more for the illusion of agency than actual agency, like we let you participate in a scene, but we don't really let you change the outcome of the scene. So, but in the moment-to-moment, like you feel like you can actually have an influence on what happens, when something happens, where you go. And I think that's critical if you want to get somebody to feel like they're actually the hero of their own story. Super simplified, but for people from a film background, not necessarily that obvious, the idea that really there is sort of this back and forth between like the story providing the motivation for interaction, and then your interaction ideally being the thing that drives the story forward, and trying to sort of design your interactions that they actually become meaningful to progressing the story. As I said, the fantasy fulfillment was a big part of what we thought about, and somewhat shamelessly, actually, we started sort of making lists really of what are our favorite Star Wars things, like what are the things that people really want to do, and it's like, have a droid and fight with a lightsaber and jump to hyperspace, and and so we basically started weaving like a lot of those ideas into the story, because we really wanted to make that deliver on that fantasy. And you can see that's also, very specifically, there's like some video game instances there as well. There's a Last of Us giraffe moment, which if you've played Last of Us, you probably remember that moment. And then there's the super tired but true concept of ludonarrative dissonance, the idea that if you have gameplay and story at the same time, that they cannot be in conflict with each other. And we certainly had moments like that in our early concept. So there's a scene towards the end of the first episode where you're at the entrance to the ancient fortress, and Darth Vader commands you to open it because you're the only one who can open this entrance. And in an early draft, we had placed a wonderful puzzle there. And it seemed like a great idea that you would solve sort of this, like, Uncharted does it a lot, like a lot of these kind of like clever puzzles, and it was very tactile, it was really fun. But it completely destroyed the scene, because you basically have like Darth Vader and stormtroopers, like glaring at you, and he says, open this. And then you're like, hang on, right? And there's no way to solve that, because you can't then have Darth Vader tutorialize that either, go like, try the red, So we ended up just cutting it, and it's basically like a button that you just place a thing and then it opens it up and you can't miss it. Because it also just killed the suspense. Like there was a certain level of like momentum going into that scene where you want to get to the end of the chapter, and it just didn't work. So there were definitely moments like that where we had sort of like things that initially sounded like a great idea, but then once you put them in the context of the story and the pacing, they just didn't work. Then there's the concept of a first-person narrative. And so if you're developing a first-person narrative in VR, then you have to make a choice sort of how do you want the person to be represented. And in very broad strokes, there's sort of a spectrum there where on the one spectrum, you can have experience where you're just you, right? Whether it's like, it just doesn't matter who you are. If you have like a tennis VR game, you can be yourself in the tennis VR game, and there's nothing that contradicts that idea of just being yourself playing tennis. And there's probably even other like narrative stories you could make that are so broad that nothing within the story necessarily tells you that you're anything other than what you really are in life. There's a version of you where you can retain your core identity, but it becomes sort of fictionalized in the context of the world. And I'll go deeper into that one in a second. There's the idea of being no one. That's whether you're like a floating camera, you're not participating, or maybe you're participating in an abstract or removed way where you can influence what is happening, but none of the characters in the experience actually ever acknowledge that you exist in there, right? You could be someone else. You could basically just, be a fictional character. And you could certainly also be something else. Like actually one of the earliest VR experiments, Jaron Lanier did one where you're a lobster, in VR. You have lobster claws. So, you can be anywhere on that spectrum with your VR content. In the context of Star Wars, you definitely have a lot of fans that get really, really into role-playing or cosplaying specific characters from the movies. But there is a limitation to that, which is that somebody can dress up as Rey or as Kylo, but the moment they take off those clothes, they become themselves again, right? They know on some deep level that they're not really Rey or they're not really Kylo. But there's a type of fan, and often it's like really, really people that get really deeply into an IP that addresses or that approaches it differently. And I think probably Star Trek is one of the first where at least I noticed it, where people would not play Worf or Spock or something like that. They would invent a Star Trek version of themselves, right? They would still have their own name and their own identity, but they would basically exist as a Star Wars officer version of themselves. And that allows them to hold both ideas sort of in their mind at the same time, and they don't necessarily ever have to stop being a Star Wars officer in their mind, And so I think in a weird way that creates like a deeper engagement there. And I think that it goes also to the heart of the popularity of both the 501st, which is this fan group of stormtroopers, and more recently also the popularity of Mandalorians, because you can still be yourself and be a Mandalorian, right? And there's something really cool about that. And so where we ended up with that is that we wanted to be that inclusive with our experience as well. And what that meant is really that we wanted to keep your identity as broad as possible. So really all you ever see of yourself is these gloves. We intentionally made them ambiguous because, obviously if you're one ethnicity and then we give you hands that are like a different skin color or a different gender, that can be like immediately create a sense of distance between you and that character that you're supposed to inhabit. We also scrubbed, if you pay attention, the entire script of any pronouns related to you. You're just referred to as captain, and that could be, either. We've given you a broad Star Wars archetype. You effectively just start out as a smuggler, and so that allows like a variety of people to project themselves in there. We chose to make you a silent protagonist, and that really, to some extent, is a result of the limitation of technology right now. Like, if we were at a point where natural language processing were good enough that you could actually just say something and reliably the computer would understand that and be able to interpret that, and then you could maybe even fit that in with a conversational AI and they could intelligently respond, that would be great, but we're not there, right? And you can't have Darth Vader sound like Alexa, right? You can't in a conversation with Darth Vader have him go, "I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand that." So, and then at the same time, we also didn't want to record somebody else's voice that suddenly comes out of your head, right? Where one, you would probably have to have a UI and go like, okay, I'm going to say this thing, and then another voice would come out of your head and say that. And that's something that, again, we really, really wanted to reduce that distance between you and the character you inhabit as much as possible, so that as much as possible it delivers of that fantasy of not I'm role-playing someone else in Star Wars, but I am in Star Wars. It's me in Star Wars, right? And then from a story perspective, that even went to the degree of a core part of the story being discovering your own secret identity, something that you don't know about at the beginning of the adventure. And that's critical because unlike in film, you can have a gap between what the protagonist knows and what the audience knows, right? And you can have a horror film where the protagonist is walking down the hall and the audience knows the killer's around the corner, but the protagonist doesn't know it, and there's like some suspense coming from that. Or vice versa, you can have like a Ocean's 11 type thing where the protagonist has an amazing plan, but the audience doesn't yet know about it. But when you are the protagonist, then you can only know as much as the character, and the character can only know as much as you, as far as like anything relevant to the story, so that people don't explain things to you that you should know, and we don't presuppose knowledge about things that you might not have, right? So with that in mind, the story, that as it is relevant to the experience, really starts only at the beginning of when you first turn it on. There is no backstory other than you're a smuggler that is relevant to it, right? So about everything that happens in the story, you and the fictional character you inhabit know exactly the same amount. That also goes to the point of that you can't tell people how to feel about something in an interactive experience. You know, you can't, in an early scene in a game or interactive experience, go like, have a character go to you and be like, oh, I killed your brother, and expect the audience member to be upset about that, because they're like, I don't even have a brother, so cool. So if you want people to feel attached to something or feel a sense of loss or care or something, you actually have to build that within the experience. You know, so if you play Shadow of the Colossus, you know that there's a part, spoiler, where your horse dies. And it's really, it is actually sort of traumatic at that point, because you've spent hours with that horse as your primary companion, and you know, like, and so at the moment you lose it, you actually have a sense of loss, but that was earned. It was earned within the experience. And then finally, that the authored story should always be in the service of the player's story, so that whatever story we tell is not there for you to just absorb and go like, okay, we're going to make you listen to this story that we're telling you. And there's a danger. I mean, I admit, like, some of our scenes are still probably wordier than, you know, they need to be. But in the end, like, whatever story is in there is only, or should only be in there if it fuels the player story, if they feel that is sort of part of the story that they take away from it. We made some choices in light of really wanting this to be like cinematic. And that meant, like, for us, no UI, because, you know, that would sort of remind you that it's kind of game-like. We made a focus on experience and wish fulfillment over things like concepts like progression or skill challenges or mastery or achievements or things like that. And even, as I said, over a concept of telling you a story. Like, the most important thing was supposed to be the experience in the sense of fantasy wish fulfillment, even if that meant there was less story or less gameplay in it, in a way. We chose to make it a single, unbroken cinematic story, so that means there are no, like, sudden location jumps or time cuts, or we never cut away from you. We chose to completely eliminate the idea of death and respawn, which I'll get back to later, but it is a really, like, weird thing that we've, I guess, sort of all grown up with games so much that it's so normal in the context of an interactive experience that you just die and then you go like 10 seconds back and then you just do the whole thing again, which obviously in real life never happens, and also in a movie generally never happens except for a couple of good ones. So we basically chose also to provide challenge there, and there are scenes that are challenging, and you can do better or worse, and sometimes you can sort of struggle to overcome like a particular section, but there's no hard fails. You're never like, there's never a game over scenario in this. And as I said, sort of the character-driven narrative became like really important to us as well, because it felt like in order to feel like a movie, there had to be other people that, you know, that Star Wars characters that you can interact with. Context of interactive narrative, you definitely have like a variety of choices there. You can make a linear story, and you can obviously make branching stories. And but the challenge with branching stories is then you just have, basically you're creating, with every choice, you create exponentially more and more content that you have to create. And it also means that fewer and fewer people see that individual piece of content here. So even with like 4 choices, you're down to like, you know, 16 potential like variations, and maybe only like 6% on average of the audience sees any of those. So very common, obviously, in games as well. You can have like branching storylines that kind of then pinch back together into pinch points, so that you have the sense of choice, but then sort of fixed moments that you go back through. And you can color those potentially just with dialogue or other details to still reflect the choices that were done earlier, but nonetheless, those points happen no matter what your choices were. If you're interested in sort of branching narrative and stuff like that, and you haven't played Detroit Become Human, you should. David Cage is an absolute madman at writing this stuff. This is like 1 chapter out of over 30, and each one of those has these like insane branching and reconnecting storylines. And you can end up with like, I think at least 6 or 7 really dramatically different endings, which then each have like different variations as well. So you end up with like 30 different endings. But when you play through it, there's something really weird, because I remember playing through that, and maybe I was just lucky with the storyline I could, but every consequence that happened in it felt inevitable, right? Like when a character died, I was like, oh God, of course that happened because I made that choice earlier. And for somebody to write a story like that and still have it, you know, make sense with all of these variations is absolutely fantastic. So I recommend that if you have time, do it. We actually chose a really linear storyline. There's a couple of reasons for that. One, we really wanted our story to be canon. If you're not into Star Wars, it's not a big deal, but for Star Wars, ever since the Disney acquisition, there's been this concept of every story that's told in Star Wars is actually part of the official history of Star Wars. And we, early on, basically got permission to have this story about Darth Vader be an official part of Darth Vader's history, right? So now it's basically just as valid as something that happened in a movie or in a comic book or in a novel about Darth Vader. And so with that in mind, it kind of had to be a linear story, you know, because you couldn't have multiple different outcomes if you wanted that to be canon. Scope was a big concern for us as well. We really wanted to rather have one story that is as rich as possible compared to basically having branching storylines where we'd have to make compromises on the scope. And then finally, as I said, sort of that focus on experience in fantasy, that we also wanted to have a story that in the end ideally was sort of as satisfying as possible and fulfilled that fantasy. And in the fantasy of being in Star Wars, you probably never really lose, right? And you never really make sort of like a terrible mistake and then die. So it was more important for us that ideally every player that goes through it sort of walks away with something that felt like an amazing, upbeat adventure where in the end they're the hero. One final thing that I think about this that I want to talk about is like this idea of a present tense character-focused story. That was really important to us, but it also is a huge commitment, right? So you have wonderful story-driven experiences like Gone Home, Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, you know, Red Matter, which is in VR, is really cool. But they're always they tend to be empty worlds, right, where miraculously everyone has disappeared. And your job is basically to sort of piece together what happened. But what that means is that the story that you're discovering is a story that happened before you got there. And so, again, it feels like you're not really the protagonist of that story. You're the protagonist of, piecing it together, but you're not part of the story that you're learning. You're just sort of, finding fragments of this and making sense of it. And we really wanted the story to be present tense, happening as you're in there, and be character focused. But as anyone who works in the industry knows, it just blows up your budget immediately, like massively, right? Because the complexity of making something with characters is just much, much bigger. We really wanted to put an emphasis on making it your story as well. And so early on, we had some scenes where two characters would meet, and they would have a long conversation. And you would just stand there and watch them talk to each other. And we noticed that people zone out super quickly. It's a combination of, I think, people getting bored because they're not part of it, and maybe even sort of a level of social cue of like, if you're at a party and there's two people that are just talking to each other, and they're not even making eye contact with you, you're kind of like, I should probably do something else. And so people started, and you could tell that people would just like, after 10 seconds, would like check out the room or check out their gloves, And so we really started infusing all of the character scenes with direct interactions where characters would make eye contact with you, address you, even if there's like 3 people in the room, they would talk to each other, but then reference you, look at you, somebody handing you something. So constantly trying to make sure that you keep being engaged with the characters. We gave you a droid companion, again, just to have someone with you almost through the entire experience. She kind of functions as as sort of a buddy. She also was really useful as a guide, so she could tutorialize a lot of things. She could sort of do, what's called nags. Sometimes, like, if you forgot what was the thing that you're supposed to do, or you're really struggling with, like, sort of a puzzle-like situation, she would basically go, hey, maybe check that thing over there. She also worked as a proxy voice. So because, as I said, we made you effectively a silent protagonist, she could actually ask questions on your behalf, things that you might wonder at that moment in the story. She could basically ask another character about that so that that conversation could still happen without you having to do it yourself. And she also, because it's for the most part sort of a pretty dark story in the sense that it's like set on Mustafar and it's like dark environment and it's gloomy. And so she provides a bit of comic relief, and we were really lucky to get Maya Rudolph to voice her. So big part of story development early on was this sentence. So when you're developing a Star Wars story, one of the things that you do is you work with the Lucasfilm Story Group. And our partner there, she's not there anymore, but Diana Williams, was sort of our liaison there. And we would pitch her situations and storylines with what you would do with Vader, because we wanted you to be in a room with Vader and do stuff with Vader. And 9 out of 10 times her answer would be, he would just kill you, right? And so that really became sort of a challenge for us to come up with a premise for the story where he couldn't just do that, right? Because we were sort of like, because he wouldn't tolerate someone who antagonizes him. He wouldn't tolerate even someone who bores him, So we basically needed to come with a premise where, in some roundabout way, Vader needs you, and so he's willing to tolerate you because he doesn't care about you as a person. You're a tool to him. And the premise within the story is basically that you have an ancient bloodline that is connected to the fortress that is under Vader's castle. He wants to get in there. He needs basically someone of your bloodline to gain access to the castle and the technology. And so to him, you're just a tool. And he only basically uses you to the extent that he gets a benefit from it. But it does mean that as long as you're useful to him, there's a reason for him to not just kill you. Pacing and editorial. So in VR and in interactive experience in general, you don't necessarily have control over how long somebody spends with a particular part of the experience. And you definitely, I think in particular in VR, you don't want to drag people through it at a pace that they're not comfortable with. We found that there are huge differences in how long people want to spend in a particular environment with a particular scene. So some people would just basically get through the story scene or the action scene and then just move on. And other people would want to explore every part of the room and every bit of artifact or art or stuff like that was in there. And so in a way, so as I said, like we basically work with like continuous time. So there's a couple of moments, one in episode 1, one in episode 2, where you effectively get knocked out, and we use that sort of as a story device to actually allow you to wake up somewhere else, and it's at a later time. But other than that, the entire experience is basically continuous. So we're not cutting away. And the pacing is really controlled by the player, and so one way to do that is space. So that means that if you want to stretch out a scene, you can actually just create more space. We don't allow you to sort of travel, even with teleport, at infinite speed. Like even if you're teleporting, there's a moment of blackout, you hear a couple of steps. And so there's a pace to how fast you can move through a space. And so you can pace how long it takes somebody to approach a particular place in an environment. It also meant that we could let people drive when they're ready to move on, as I said. So for the most part, a lot of our story is set in a way where in an environment, a scene will play out, and you pretty quickly realize that after the scene is played out, for the most part, you can actually stay in that environment if you want to, knowing that once you move into the next environment, it'll in a way trigger the next scene of the story. So you kind of control how much time you want to spend in there. And then triggers can obviously also be used, like in games in general. Like if you want to make sure that somebody doesn't miss something, then it just doesn't happen until they look that way, right? Because you can't control where they're looking, but you can check where they're looking, and then once they're looking that way, that's when the interesting thing happens. Also, as I said, we wanted to balance like high-intensity action with sort of more story-driven, calmer moments. As I said earlier on, like we generally thought that passive VR wasn't a good fit for this, but actually every episode of Vader Immortal contains a short scene that is drawn and animated then in Quill that is completely different style, stylized, and is completely non-interactive. And they're used to sort of tell a bit of legend. They're pretty short, again, because we realized actually people would enjoy it for about like 30 seconds or so, and then they would get kind of like antsy. But most people actually really liked sort of this break, both not having to do anything and also seeing something that's a completely different visual style for a moment. And then also alternating space, again, something that video games do as well, very well. Big open spaces and then really tight spaces. And I think in VR that's particularly effective, that if you want a big vista to feel amazing, then you put people in a really tight claustrophobic space before that, so that when they come out, there's this big contrast of scope and scale, or vice versa. Environmental storytelling, I mean, that's obviously in video games also like a often used sort of the graffiti on the wall type thing. We actually ended up sort of offloading some of the backstory stuff in a neat way into some environmental stuff. So, and it's entirely up to you. Like if you want to just race past it, you can. But there's sort of like these wall paintings, or there might be like a tapestry or stuff like that, where you can find like some of these hints of like snippets of a deeper backstory of the fortress and of the characters. and some people really like it. So, and some people just blast past it. And so that again goes sort of to like letting people kind of move at their own pace in VR. I think is a good idea. Cinematography. I mean, obviously, you can't tell people where to look. You can only guide them there with like typical things like you do in video games as well, with like lighting, with motion, that if you want somebody to look over there, then you have a spaceship that flies that way, and then they tend to follow it with their eyes. Lighting, drawing people's eye. Sound, obviously, also a big part of it. Another thing is that we wanted to have those epic moments that felt like a cool establishing shot from a movie, from a Star Wars movie. And so you can, again, with clever level design, you can orchestrate that, right? I mean, Uncharted does that all the time as well, where you're just like cresting a hill and then you get like the beautiful view or something, or you come out of a cave entrance. And so we ended up doing that as well. Like we really thought about sort of, if this were a movie, like what is the angle that you would want to give, like that your establishing shot would be, and then we would let the path of the player sort of pass through that cool establishing shot moment. Interaction design, became like a huge part of it as well, and happened along the way, and actually happened really in parallel with the story development still, which I think was really important, because one, we needed to learn sort of what was actually fun in VR, and so hacking things with a lightsaber, surprisingly really satisfying. So that definitely became a thing. But there were also things that that we didn't really expect. So an early prototype of climbing just sort of happened, and was so satisfying that we actually ended up writing that both into the level design, but also actually into the story. And like one of my favorite little moments with Zoe just came out of this, like incorporating the climbing mechanic back into the story, where you're climbing up and you effectively make it so that the thing that you're holding onto breaks, and you almost fall off, and she reaches down and gives you, like offers her hand and then pulls you up. And it was just a really neat little moment of having like a direct interaction that sort of, hopefully again sort of cements that relationship that you have with this digital character. And it's kind of just fun in VR to just grab somebody's hand. It's just a weird thing. Tests with like, simple AI stuff. As I said, teleportation, you have to think about that. We ended up incorporating a lot of options for comfort in terms of like either continuous motion or teleport motion, snap turns, continuous turns, all of these things, because the last thing you want to do is like make people sick as they're going through your story. And we even have options that let you entirely skip things like climbing, because it just made some people uncomfortable. And I think there it's sort of, you can put forward your ideal version, but I think with VR, it's so important that you give people options to do what's comfortable for them, because the last thing you want is someone taking off the headset mid-story because you made them uncomfortable or sick. One thing that's super like normal is that people will test the boundaries of the world. And I think that's in particular challenging with VR content, because when you have a traditional video game, you can more easily restrict the mechanics of what people can do. But in VR, as soon as you give them hands, they can kind of try and do whatever they want with their hands. And so one of the things we found pretty early on is like, when Vader comes really close to someone, people will try to poke him. And it's a perfectly normal thing. And so our first instinct was to do what Lone Echo did, which Lone Echo actually has a really nice, clever system that if you try to touch the captain, she kind of shoots you a dirty look and goes like, stop it, or something along those lines. She has a few different lines. And you do actually feel like bad about it, and you probably kind of stop, But again, that doesn't work with Vader. Like, you can't poke Vader and Vader goes, stop it. And so early on we had some ideas, okay, well, what if he like just starts force choking you, right? But that's sort of the wrong instinct, because Vader force choking you is interesting. And so you're rewarding destructive behavior, right? Like if someone is trying to break your experience and you're going, oh, we're going to reward that with a really interesting moment. And it also has nowhere to go, because if he force chokes you the first time, then what happens if you poke him the second time or the third time? Does he get more angry or not? So we actually just did a really easy way out, which is that when you're trying to touch him, your hand just kind of goes invisible, like it goes ghostly. And while that, in the moment, it sort of like breaks the illusion of it, it very quickly tells the player, like, don't bother, right? Like, that won't get you anywhere, and that's not going to be interesting. And so, you know, if you're not playing along, we're not gonna reward it. Flip side of it is, if people actually play along, then you do want to reward that. And so, you know, if you're in the ship and you're like exploring, and you just pick up some stuff.
There's our ship, the Windfall. Wasn't she beautiful when we first stole her? A lot of parsecs on the old girl now, huh? Kind of a miracle she's still carrying us around. Oh, but I digress.
Right, and so there's things that you can pick up, and it's kind of part of the story that, you know, you're picking these things up, and Zoe basically gives you little bits of backstory about, you know, what your relationship might have been in the past and the adventures you've been through. And so that's the kind of like participation and engagement that you want to reward. And so we have, you know, things like that in there. If you work in games, then you're obviously familiar with the idea of gray boxing or white boxing. You know, so we started at that point and also just building the rough architectural layout, trying to understand what the spaces are. As I said, it's really important for VR. I think that you very quickly start building these spaces and get people in there and look at them in the headset, you know, because that's the only way really to evaluate whether something works or not. And even in this super rough stage, we learned like a ton of stuff of how to lay out the castle and everything. So then as gray boxing sort of starts solidifying, you can start doing concept art. We obviously have a fantastic concept art department at ILM, and they started, you know, making these designs. You know, like doing mood boards and like, you know, all the stuff that you do both in film and like AAA games. And then again, like if you work in games, you're familiar with this, but when you don't work in games, I think for a lot of people that came from the film side, it was sort of unsettling for how long in production things kind of looked like this.
Move it, hotshot. The Grodians want their spice back. We have
right,
to
so you have
her we're dead. Quick,
like temp geometry. You have like just voiceover that a coordinator recorded. You have no lighting. Like a lot of your stuff is still kind of you know, janky, like animation and everything. But this is the stage at which you want to iterate, because, you know, again, like games, this is obvious, but with an interactive experience, you can only figure out if it works through like playing it again, and figuring out like what works, what doesn't work. And you absolutely do not want to put a ton of money and effort into making things look beautiful that you're then going to throw away. And we had entire like sections of the castle that just once you started playing through them, you're like, this part's boring, or this part doesn't fit the pacing, or it's not, you know, it doesn't work from an interaction perspective. And so the moment you sort of start going for like final quality content, you're just bleeding money like crazy. So you really want to make sure that you make as many decisions as possible before that, which can be challenging for people from the film industry to wrap their head around, because they often would go like, no, it's going to be great once we have like the actual actor say this line, or, you know, it's going to be great once this environment looks beautiful, because it's basically like, which some filmmakers can do, like trying to put an entire film together as previs and understanding does it work or not at the previs level, but most people are not comfortable with that. This was fun. So eventually we obviously got to do a ton of mocap. There's a mocap actress for Zoe who actually specifically learned how to ride a hoverboard, and because she doesn't have legs, right? So she's basically did all of her, or the majority of her mocap on a hoverboard, which was actually really cool. It worked out really, really well. Again, if you're from a film background, I think you sort of underestimate maybe the amount of mocap and animation implementation work that goes into not your cinematic scenes, but all of the stuff in between. That if you have an interactive experience, a lot of the characters, a lot of the time, have to go in and out of particular behaviors based on what you do. They're either waiting for you, or they're reacting to something they're doing, or you're interrupting them. And so you end up, rather than on a film where you're recording like long takes, in addition to that, you're recording lots and lots of like really, really short clips that you can then sort of interactively put together. And it's, again, sort of, I think you need to, if you're trying to make this kind of character-driven content in VR, you need to bring people in with animation background in games that can actually sort of advise and plan that, because it's very, very different from film or animation. And then, as I said, we finally got like really nice voice talent. So Maya Rudolph, who's in like The Good Place and Saturday Night Live and stuff like that, voiced Zoe. A lot of sort of the funnier, cuter lines from Zoe came just from her, just ad-libbing. There's Ben Snow, who was our overall director, and David Goyer, the writer, sort of doing that, the recording session. Can't overstate music. It's sort of a weird thing that you think in VR, like in real life, if you walk into like a dark alley, it's not suddenly ominous music starts playing. But in VR, it feels completely natural. Like it doesn't even register. We're so trained from from film and games that that's a completely natural thing. And so Will Roger and Chris Velasco wrote like original score for all 3 episodes. I'll show you. I'll play a little clip for that in a second. And then Skywalker Sound did like a lot of the sound design, and that obviously a huge part of Star Wars as well. From like the sound of a TIE fighter screaming by to like, you know, the sound of a lightsaber, you know, like holding it up next to your head. Like all really, really fantastic work that they did on that. There's a couple more ways you can engage senses. So one obvious one is haptics. It's obviously vibrators in your controllers, and so we did a pass-through of trying to really fit like as many little moments to that as possible. And then there's an undervalued sense, which I think though is super important in VR, because in VR you're playing with your own body, right? Your body in a way becomes the controller, and proprioception is the sense that you have of your own body's position and motion. And you can actually use that as a storytelling device as well. So there's a scene in this where we want you to wanted you to spy on Vader. You're hearing something and witnessing something that you're not supposed to see. And what we did is actually intentionally make it so that the only way that you can see it through a grate is if you actually bend down and kind of peer through it, right? You had to get really close to it, and you kind of had to like duck down. And we sort of stole that from, because I remembered going to Sleep No More, the Punch Drunk show in New York, and they had this moment where you're following 2 characters, and then they go into a hut and they shut the door, but you have like these little slits, and the only way that you can see what's going inside is to get really close and, you know, like peer. And so I think this body motion of, you know, like having to like get down and like kind of, you know, pierce through some crack. Oops, sorry. Well, you get the idea. Like it really supports that sense of spying, you know. And so that's, I think, along with other moments, I think you really want to think about like, can you make people do things with their body that actually support the story? So finally, then you get to...
We better move it, Captain. The Hutts want their spice back. We gotta jump to hyperspace or we're dead. Come on, flip the switches for the hyperdrive.
So that's, you know, you can see that shows sort of in production, now with all the bells and whistles.
All right, hyperdrive controls are activated. Make the jump to light speed.
That, by the way, was sort of the only time, like, that's one of the first scenes where we actually do a little bit of UI. That's just to show, like, you know, how do you grab something how do you teleport, and we do that once, and then after that, there's no more UI for the rest of the experience. Things that we learned that work really well for us, sort of lizard brain moments, and by that I mean sort of things like obvious, like vertigo, and to some extent like jump scares or like things getting like threateningly close, but also like sort of beautiful vistas and stuff like that. Character interactions, as I said, eye contact, people handing you stuff, people talking to you is strong. One of the things that's really nice about VR is that intuitive interaction, the idea that you don't have to abstract how people interact other than let's say, teleportation. You don't have to abstract how people interact with the environment. Like, you don't have to go, okay, well, the triangle is how you pick something up, and the X button is how you swipe sideways. Like, people just do it. And so that's actually really cool if you can design that way. As I said, large scale, small scale, environmental storytelling. And then, ideally engaging as many senses as possible. The big part of this, though, what we really want to achieve with it in the end is like that sense of creating memories, and that ideally people walk away from this experience feeling like they've actually been in Star Wars for a moment, and they actually remember that as a personal experience. I'll show you at the end, just for fun. I'll play, if I can, just like a minute or so. Because one of the things that's really fun, you should, if you think about music, you want to get someone who is from a video game background as well, because again, quite often they have to play, compose music that is flexible, right? That you don't know how long a scene will last, and so you want to be able to sort of have that music be flexible enough. Will Roger is fantastic at capturing that John Williams feel, and so this is like original music that one of the pieces that he wrote. Well, then I guess we're almost there. Then do we have a minute for a Q&A? Or? Yeah, okay. Let's do it.
Thank you so much, Mohen. That was it was so fantastic, and so many really tangible insights in there that well, I've written about 4 pages of notes as you were going, so I'll be looking at those tomorrow. We do have a bit of time for Q&A. Have we got any questions from the floor? We have one at the back. Elaine's going to come to you with a mic.
Hi there. I just wanted to ask, you mentioned at the end there about giving a player a sense of where your body is at any time. And I don't know how much of this decision came down to giving the player, having a non kind of gender or ethnicity specific avatar, but what was the thinking behind, like when we're creating VR experiences, we have a lot of internal discussions about whether you have the disembodied hands or whether you give the player a body. Right. I kind of feel like in Lone Echo, in that sequence you put up there, when I played that, I kind of felt like part of the kind of peril of that is that because you kind of have a body and you feel like, if I have a body, then my body can get damaged by the thing that's coming towards me. I was just wondering what drove the decision to go one way rather than the other.
That's a totally valid question. I think with the this was obviously designed for the Oculus Quest and Rift, and so you have a limited number of tracking points. You really only have 3-ish. What we found with even from the Void experience early on is that if you give people a body, but the body doesn't do what their real body is doing, then it's actually almost more disorienting than not having a body, right? And so Lone Echo does a fantastic job, but it also only works as well as it does because it's in zero gravity, and you kind of have that suspension of disbelief of just like floating around. Whereas the moment you look down and you see your legs doing something that your legs aren't doing, it can actually be pretty jarring, I think. It also greatly increases the complexity of just like tracking your body and fight sequences and all of those things, to make that like feel. I feel where we ended up is like people didn't seem to miss the body, like seeing the body in our experience. But I think as technology advances and we get like much better, even just like optical skeletal tracking and stuff like that, which you now have like an ARKit 3 even as a basic thing, definitely I think it's something I would want to incorporate, because I think even though people don't necessarily miss it, I think it's totally a way that you can add immersion to it if you do it correctly.
Thanks. Any other questions? We have a couple over here.
I love the experiences. Thank you very much for that. Could you talk a bit about how you designed the Force?
Right. That was actually an interesting one, because it's one of those where everyone has like a very clear sense in their mind of what it should be, and it started out sort of needing to compromise with the necessities of actually working in the context of like some level of skill challenge and combat and stuff like that, because the initial thought was like, oh, we're just going to have it buttonless, and you're just going to reach out your hand, and then things are going to start floating, and then you're going to do something gestural. But that doesn't really work, or would get frustrating very quickly if you have to do things quickly, and you want to pick something up and chuck it at someone, and grab someone, right? And so it ended up being that we ended up actually making that connection much quicker than you would expect. The first time you do it, when Vader goes like, grab this, intentionally it's like slow, and it takes a long time, and you have to hold out your hand, and it vibrates a little bit, and eventually you get it. But then, as you get into the more of the gameplay things, it has to be quick, because otherwise it just gets frustrating, right? And so it ended up being a bit of a compromise of maybe making it less mystical and a little bit more utilitarian. But I think in order for people to feel powerful and skilled with it and be able to sort of do cool chucking stuff around, it had to actually be like, it had to effectively have a button, and it had to be quick.
And we have one more over there.
Thanks. I've only played through episode 1 so far, but it absolutely blew me away in terms of the immersion and the storytelling. My question is, what would you like to do that perhaps you weren't quite able to do in this technology-wise, or what's next?
So there's a really deep thing that I could go into. There is, I think, this idealized version of what we want virtual reality to be, right? And it's something that is actually not like, it's not like a game. So one of the weird shorthands, if you're of the right generation, is like the holodeck, right, on Star Trek. This idea that you could go into a virtual space and it is ideally as indistinguishable from reality as possible, and the characters are like, you know, behave like real characters, and you can just experience it like a different fictional thing. All of the pieces that have to come together for that are like really, really difficult right now. And so, as I said, it's sort of like character AI and conversational AI and all of these things. So we find ourselves actually more aligned, I think, at the moment with some of the games that intentionally stray away from relying on mechanics as the primary, well, mechanics and skill challenges and progression and stuff as a primary motivator, and more sort of into the direction of like a shelter or something like that, where you're where it's more what we would like to do, I think, is sort of start creating worlds where your interaction is less authored, right? We're not telling you, you do this, then that, then that, then that, but there's more systems behind it. There's more sort of ways of you to choose your own story, because I think that does make things feel more personal. But we're also working within the limitations of the hardware and the technology that exists right now. And so I think that's going to be, like, I think all of us sort of more or less know what we want it to be like 20 years from now. But it's a question right now of what are the compromises you make. And I think, sorry, one final thought on that is you also have to think about the market right now. People that own headsets are primarily people who play games. And that doesn't mean that you have to make a game, but you have to make content that people who play games enjoy, right? So in an ideal version, we would want to be. I think in an ideal version, we could stray more into like sort of systems and open world and almost put the cognitive load of like skill challenge and stuff like that out of your head so you can engage more with the world. But even Vader Immortal actually got some mixed reviews, right? It got some very, very positive reviews, but also like other people said like, it's too linear, there's not enough agency, there's too much talking, there's not enough depth in like the game mechanics, because if you approach from a game mechanics perspective, you want to go like, oh, I have a lightsaber, now I want like 8 hours of, Jonathan Blow progressively exploring all of the things that you could do with a lightsaber. And we just go like, your lightsaber for 2 minutes, and then we move on, because that's what you would do in a movie. So that balance between like making stuff that gamers enjoy, but still trying to push sort of in a different direction, is something that I think is going to dictate a lot of what you can do in VR in the foreseeable future. It's a really long answer.
Okay, is there one last question from the floor? Over here.
Is there any work currently in progress to actually put yourself in a real physical environment, so to map your current, your actual environment, so you don't sort of bang your hand into the walls or the sofa while you're doing it?
So I know what you're referring to. Actually, if you go on my Twitter, that's funny. So my Twitter is just like my name, Mohen Leo. There's a thing I did like last year where I actually made an Unreal version of my apartment at home and lined up all the furniture with just like, it's really sad why I would do that. But but it was like my 15 seconds of fame, like Variety picked it up for some reason. So I think there's a safety concern of that where I think it does that really well right now with the Guardian system and stuff. I think what you're talking about maybe is a procedural integration of that. And I think that is a really interesting idea, that you could basically go, I'm on this bridge of a spaceship, and it knows like, that's the thing you sit on, and that's a table, and therefore it's going to make that my captain's chair, and that my thing, and it lays out things in that way. So you can freely walk around your room and still play that story. And I think that's a cool idea. I don't know, I think, Rick and Morty actually does that to some extent, not quite that far, but it actually scales the layout of the garage that you're in based on how big your play space is, right? So you can totally do that. It does greatly complicate any design that you do around that, though. So I think it's going to take a while for people to try that.
Brilliant. If I actually may steal one last question of my own while I have the mic. I was really interested in what you said at the beginning about the writer that you worked with, David Goyer, and how the initial instinct was to write a screenplay, and that you quite fairly quickly, I guess, tossed that out the window and started again. That must have been quite a process for him and for you. And we do a lot of work with writers' rooms. My colleague Adam Gantz runs writers' rooms for StoryFutures Academy, and it's always really interesting how we try to get writers to think a different way. What was that process like for you and him?
He was a great sport about it, because we did actually throw away like that script and then multiple versions of subsequent sort of things. But I think he was so motivated to try that. But it was really the collaboration with the game designer, and so the game designer and so the lead game director Colin McKay. And I would basically even go to LA, sit down with David Goyer, and for the most part, really through that process, just whiteboard the hell out of it. And he got very comfortable with the idea of discussing sort of general flow and what happens in the scenes, and really just getting down to sort of like bullet points of like, in this scene, like you meet this character, there's this conflict, and you have this interaction and that. And he would buy off at that level and go like, yep, I think that framework works. And then we would go and gray box the hell out of it, have him play that, and then he would go like, I don't really like this thing. We'd do like a lot of scratch dialogue internally, so we just have our staff we had a guy that could do a good Vader impression, so he would just do all the Vader impressions, right? And he would just do like temp dialogue and scratch dialogue. Even like Ben Snow, our director, would like write sort of like temp dialogue, and it was like, okay, we just need him to say something so we can plug it in and you can play it. And then we'd show it to David, and then eventually, when we were collectively happy with it, David would go and basically go like, okay, now I'm going to write final dialogue. But that would really only happen at the end. But I think along the way, that constant collaboration and communication was really critical in having the game designer and the writer sort of really be talking the same language.
Thank you so much. Okay, one more round of applause, please. Thank you so much.